The camera pans across a quiet suburban skyline, gleaming rooftops, white fences, and manicured lawns glinting under the afternoon sun. But the tranquility is deceptive, because beneath those perfect facades lies a scandal that shook an entire county. 12 luxury villas, built by a powerful HOA and backed by millionaire developers, rose overnight on what they claimed was community land. The blueprint said authorized. The county permits said approved. The residents said progress. But the truth? They were building on a man's private property. And they didn't even know it. His name was Samuel Drayton, a quiet rancher, the last heir to a century-old estate tucked at the edge of the new development zone. For years, he'd watched the HOA swallow acres around him, inch by inch, permit by permit, until the border between his land and theirs blurred into convenient confusion. Then one morning, the sound of bulldozers shattered his peace. Trucks rolled in. Concrete poured. 12 villas began to rise, not near his property, but on it. And here's the twist. Samuel didn't stop them. He didn't call the sheriff. He didn't post signs or file complaints. He let them finish. Every nail, every tile, every glass pane, all paid for by the HOA's deep pockets. Because Samuel had something they didn't. The deed. The real one. The original. Hand-signed title that proved those $12 million villas, the pride of Alder Ridge HOA, stood squarely on land that didn't belong to them. What followed was a storm of lawsuits, fraud investigations, and a courtroom drama so explosive that even the developers didn't see it coming. This is the story of how one man, patient, calculating and quietly furious, brought down an entire HOA empire using nothing more than paperwork, persistence, and timing. They thought they owned his land, but he owned everything they built on it. And when he walked into court with that deed in hand, the whole town learned what happens when greed builds its house, the first cracks. In the quiet of Alder Ridge began not with noise, but with arrogance. For years, the land behind the ironwood trees belonged to Samuel Drayton, a 62-year-old retired civil engineer, who had spent half his life designing other people's dream homes, and the other half restoring the one he inherited from his father. His property wasn't just land, it was legacy. 36 acres of rolling pasture and oak, surrounded by a crumbling stone fence that dated back to 1894. The old survey map still bore his family name, embossed in fading ink, Drayton Estate. But the world beyond his boundary line had changed. What once were dirt roads and apple fields had been transformed into a tidy maze of manicured lawns, trimmed hedges, and freshly painted villas. The Alder Ridge Homeowners Association, a board of polished smiles and sharper ambitions, had crept closer year by year, buying parcels and rezoning lots until they bordered Samuel's fence line. At first, it didn't concern him. He'd seen enough developments rise and fall to know how time weathered greed. But what he didn't expect was the quiet theft, the invisible encroachment that began with survey stakes hammered into his soil without a word of permission. When the first orange markers appeared, Samuel assumed it was a mistake. Perhaps a utility crew misread a plot line or a new homeowner misplaced their property edge. But when heavy machinery arrived, churning up his earth and flattening his meadows, the truth struck him cold. They weren't building near his property. They were building on it. Concrete trucks lined the dirt road that cut through the back of his land. Excavators clawed trenches into the hillside, and men in bright yellow vests poured foundations where Samuel's cattle once grazed. 12 villas, according to the glossy banner that now flapped in the wind. The villas at Alder Ridge, modern living with timeless views. The HOA had extended their reach, without notice, without deed, and without fear. Samuel watched from the edge of his porch, coffee cooling in his hands, as strangers reshaped the earth that bore his family's name. Rage burned under his calm exterior, but years of engineering and contract work had taught him one rule: never react until you've read the paperwork. So he spent 3 days in his study, He pulled out old deeds, land surveys, notarized transfers, tax receipts, documents his father had kept meticulously. The chain of ownership was unbroken. The land was his, legally and completely. He cross-checked with county records, tracing lot numbers and zoning approvals. That's when he saw it, the error, buried deep within an updated county plat. A digital rescan had shifted a boundary line by exactly 146 feet westward. That line cut straight through his meadow. On paper, it now looked as if the HOA's development company owned a slice of his property. It was a clerical mistake, one that any competent engineer could spot. But it was also a mistake the HOA had taken advantage of. Someone had noticed the error and decided not to correct it. The permits, Samuel discovered, were fast-tracked using that flawed map. A development worth millions had been approved on a digital glitch, one that stripped him of nearly 5 acres. It would have been easy to file a complaint, to storm into the HOA office and demand answers. But Samuel's mind worked differently. The moment he understood what they had done, a plan began to form. A quiet, devastating plan that would unravel everything they thought they owned. Instead of calling lawyers, he called his surveyor friend from the next county over, a man he trusted completely. They remeasured every inch, verified every coordinate, and drafted a private record of the land's true boundaries. Samuel filed it discreetly with the county archives, not as a correction, but as a reassertion of original ownership. Legally binding, unassailable. Meanwhile, construction continued. Weeks turned into months. The villas rose from concrete to timber, from framework to luxury shells with wide glass balconies and imported stone facades. The HOA celebrated progress, boasting online about their new expansion of luxury living. Buyers began to place deposits. Signs went up boasting Phase 1 sold out. All the while, Samuel said nothing. He mowed his lawn, fixed his fences, and waved politely at workers who had no idea they were standing on someone else's land. He even lent water from his private well when the site's supply line malfunctioned, quietly observing, documenting, and waiting. Behind his calm smile, he was building something far stronger than outrage. A case. He gathered every photo, permit, drone image, and timestamp. He saved copies of the HOA's newsletters where they bragged about the villa's completion schedule. He recorded the sound of construction crews breaking ground beyond the survey markers he'd placed discreetly at the true boundary line. Piece by piece, he built a wall of evidence taller than any of their villas. By spring, the villas were nearly complete. 12 immaculate homes gleamed under the morning sun, each one standing proudly on land that did not belong to them. Homeowners began visiting the site, touring their future living rooms and praising the HOA for its visionary leadership. The president of the HOA, a woman named Valerie Kane, even sent a flyer to Samuel's mailbox, an invitation to the grand opening of Alder Ridge Phase 2. The irony made him laugh quietly in his kitchen, but when he looked out the window that evening, he noticed something else. Men surveying again. This time pushing further toward his main house. The HOA wasn't done. They were planning Phase 3, a clubhouse and pool complex that would eat into another portion of his land. That night, Samuel opened his leather file case and reviewed the evidence one last time. His patience had reached its limit, and the trap he had set was finally ready to spring. He didn't just want compensation. He wanted exposure. He wanted the entire HOA to realize what they had built their empire on, and who truly owned the ground beneath their perfect, painted homes. By the time the villas were finished and the first new residents received their keys, Samuel Drayton was ready. The deed was secure, the evidence airtight, and the county's zoning commission had unknowingly played right into his hands. He stood on his porch the morning the ribbon-cutting ceremony began, watching the crowd gather with champagne and smiles. Cameras flashed, real estate agents beamed, and the HOA president made a speech about community growth. Samuel said nothing. He only smiled, sipping his coffee again, as he realized what was about to happen next, because in exactly 6 days, a single envelope would arrive at the county courthouse. An envelope that would change everything. The morning the envelope arrived at the county courthouse, the air over Alder Ridge was crisp and still. No one in the HOA offices had any reason to suspect the storm that was brewing beneath their feet. To them, it was another successful day in their suburban empire. A day of ribbon cuttings, new deposits, and celebratory press releases. But in the quiet archives department of the county registrar's office, a clerk slid open a certified envelope marked Property Title Reassertion, Drayton Estate. Inside lay a collection of documents so meticulous, so complete that it immediately drew attention. Hand-signed surveys, notarized deeds, tax histories, and a formal notice of boundary discrepancy, all backed by the unmistakable seal of the original Drayton Plat from 1894. The clerk followed procedure and logged the submission. Within hours, a supervisor noticed the conflict between the Drayton filings and the existing Alder Ridge zoning plat. Protocol demanded escalation. The county's GIS department was notified. They ran a cross-reference and found that the coordinates didn't just overlap slightly. They overlapped entirely. 5 acres of land, legally and historically belonging to Samuel Drayton, had been approved for development under a mismatched digital boundary file. The moment the data synced with the public record, the system flagged the inconsistency. On paper, the HOA's proud villas now sat squarely within a recorded private property. Meanwhile, Samuel continued his routine life at the ranch, calm as a man who already knew the outcome. He'd spent months preparing for this moment, a slow, deliberate buildup that would expose not just negligence, but arrogance. He hadn't stopped with documentation. He'd anticipated resistance, even corruption. And so, alongside his filing, he'd included copies to 3 key offices: the county assessor, the planning commission, and the zoning enforcement board. Each office, upon receiving its copy, began its own internal audit. That audit set off a chain reaction, quiet, bureaucratic, but unstoppable. Inspectors visited the development under the guise of a routine compliance check. They photographed, measured, and compared. When they returned to their offices, the reality sank in. The HOA had built 12 multi-million-dollar villas on land they didn't own. News of the discovery spread silently at first. A few emails between departments, a whispered conversation in a hallway. But in small counties, whispers travel faster than wind. Within a week, the local newspaper caught scent of a recording error linked to a luxury housing project. They didn't yet have the name Drayton attached, but the HOA board did. Inside their glass-paneled meeting room, the Alder Ridge HOA convened in panic. Their president, Valerie Kane, reviewed the county's notice in disbelief. The legal description was clear. All structures currently standing within Parcel 4BX fall within the original boundary lines of the Drayton estate. That single sentence meant disaster. Construction loans, sales contracts, and homeowner agreements all hinged on the validity of that land title. If it was wrong, if even 1 inch of that land was privately owned, every sale could be voided, every title reversed, every home unsellable. But Valerie and her board didn't know Samuel's hand in it yet. They assumed it was a clerical attack, maybe a disgruntled neighbor or a competitor. So they called their lawyers, who promised to handle the situation quietly. Letters were drafted, requests for clarification sent to the county office. The lawyers expected an easy fix, a digital amendment to restore the line as it appeared in their version of the plat. What they didn't expect was the county's response. A formal injunction freezing all property transactions associated with the disputed land until ownership could be verified. It was no longer a private dispute. It was now an open land title investigation. As days passed, construction workers began to leave. Buyers called for updates. Realtors grew nervous. The HOA issued vague statements about administrative delays, but the anxiety spread fast. Valerie's polished confidence began to crack as investors called, demanding answers. And while all this unfolded, Samuel remained silent. He spent his evenings on the porch reading the local news with a faint, knowing smile. The trap had been sprung perfectly. He wasn't seeking chaos for chaos's sake. He wanted justice through precision. He knew that emotion lost court battles, but evidence won them. So he prepared the next stage. In his workshop, Samuel laid out a long wooden table covered with every relevant document. The 1894 deed under his grandfather's name, the 1978 recertification filed by his father, the 1994 land tax revaluation, showing continued Drayton ownership, the latest drone photographs showing GPS coordinates, aligned with those deeds. He'd already engaged a land use attorney from out of county, someone unconnected to the local political machine. Together, they drafted the filing that would follow the county's injunction, a quiet title action designed to legally reclaim ownership of every square foot of land occupied by the villas. It would not only restore his rights, but expose the HOA's negligence, or, more likely, deliberate deceit. In the following weeks, county inspectors completed their field analysis. When the final report was issued, it confirmed what Samuel had known all along. The digital survey uploaded by Alder Ridge Development Corp. was off by 146.3 feet, caused by an unverified map projection offset. The result was that the HOA had, whether knowingly or not, constructed 12 luxury residences inside the Drayton boundary. The findings were public record, and the HOA's empire began to crumble. Valerie's board faced furious homeowners who had already invested hundreds of thousands. Their attorneys scrambled to negotiate settlements, but every attempt was blocked by Samuel's legal filing. He wasn't negotiating. He was reclaiming. The county, faced with legal exposure, refused to amend the record without a full court review. That review would take months. In the meantime, every sale, every deed transfer, and every mortgage related to the villas was suspended. The once celebrated Alder Ridge expansion now stood silent, beautiful but tainted. 12 empty homes gleaming like ghosts under the sun. Samuel's attorney quietly submitted the next motion, a notice of trespass and unlawful enrichment, citing that all structures built upon his land now legally belonged to him unless the court ruled otherwise. It was a chess move, slow, deliberate, devastating. The HOA tried to reach him through intermediaries, but he refused to engage outside legal channels. The case was now too large for negotiation. It had entered the system, and the system was on his side. Weeks later, Valerie received a court summons. The words Drayton versus Alder Ridge HOA et al. Stared back at her like a curse, and as the HOA scrambled to mount their defense, Samuel took one final step. He called a local journalist. He didn't give them everything, just enough to light the match. By the time the article ran, developer accused of building on private land without ownership. The story had already gone viral across the state. The world was beginning to learn what Alder Ridge had built its luxury on, and Samuel Drayton was only getting started. The time the first court date was set, Alder Ridge was no longer a quiet neighborhood. It was a scandal. News vans parked along the once pristine entrance boulevard, cameras flashing each morning as lawyers in expensive suits shuffled into the courthouse. The HOA board, once seen as the epitome of suburban order, now looked nervous, defensive, and divided. Inside courtroom 3B, the air felt electric. The case, Drayton versus Alder Ridge HOA and Alder Ridge Development Corporation, had become a symbol of property rights versus corporate greed. Every reporter in town wanted a headline, every homeowner wanted reassurance, and every developer in the county watched closely, wondering if they could be next. Samuel Drayton arrived quietly, wearing a simple gray suit and a calm expression. He wasn't there to make a scene. He was there to win, methodically, piece by piece. His attorney, a seasoned litigator named Evelyn Marks, had already spent weeks preparing exhibits that would expose the full chain of deceit. Across the aisle sat the HOA's legal team, 4 lawyers, 2 corporate representatives, and their president, Valerie Kane. Her confidence had eroded since the first injunction. The villas still stood empty, construction halted indefinitely, investors demanding refunds. The weight of 12 unfinished lives, buyers who'd signed contracts for homes that might never legally exist, pressed on her shoulders like lead. The proceedings began with formality. The judge, a sharp and deliberate man named Justice Rowan, asked for opening statements. Evelyn spoke first, her tone steady and surgical. She laid out the facts. A century-old deed, verified ownership, county-recognized boundaries, and clear proof that Alder Ridge had built on land it did not own. Then came the kicker, the timeline. Evelyn presented the sequence of events. The county's digital map update in 2018. The boundary error, identified as a projection offset. The HOA's knowledge of the discrepancy, evidenced by an internal email from a contracted surveyor warning of a potential overlap, and the decision by Alder Ridge Development to proceed anyway, citing time-sensitive investor pressure. Each point hit like a hammer. Valerie's face tightened with every slide that appeared on the courtroom screen. The HOA's defense tried to downplay the issue, framing it as a harmless technical glitch, an honest mistake. But that defense fell apart quickly when Evelyn unveiled a letter from the HOA's engineering subcontractor, dated 6 months before construction began, explicitly mentioning that part of the proposed villas encroached on privately held land registered under Drayton ownership. The letter had been ignored. The courtroom murmured. The HOA's attorneys tried to object, claiming irrelevance, but the judge overruled them. The document was admissible. Then came Samuel's moment. When he took the stand, he spoke softly, but every word carried weight. He described how he'd watched the construction unfold, how he'd double-checked every map and file, how he'd allowed the villas to rise deliberately, knowing that one day the truth would bring the entire project to its knees. There was no bitterness in his voice, only certainty. The kind of calm that comes from knowing the law is finally catching up to arrogance. As he spoke, photos flashed on the courtroom screen. His drone images, his time-stamped footage, his hand-drawn maps comparing the real boundaries to the falsified ones. His documentation was flawless, and the defense couldn't shake it. The HOA's lawyers tried to paint Samuel as opportunistic, a man lying in wait to profit from their mistake. But Evelyn dismantled that argument with ease, reminding the court that Samuel had filed his evidence months before any profit could be made, and that his filings were verified by the county registrar long before. Public scandal began. By the end of the first week of hearings, it was clear. The HOA had no moral ground left. Outside, the media frenzy grew. Headlines screamed, "HOA built million-dollar homes on private land. Homeowners trapped in legal limbo as villas face seizure. Retired engineer outsmarts entire development corporation." The story resonated. Ordinary people saw in Samuel a kind of quiet justice, a man who refused to be bullied by the powerful, who fought not with noise but with precision. As pressure mounted, some of the future villa owners banded together and filed their own suits against the HOA, claiming fraud and misrepresentation. The board began to splinter. 2 members resigned publicly, blaming Valerie for her reckless leadership. In the courtroom, Evelyn made her final move. She introduced a motion for summary judgment, a direct ruling that would officially transfer all 12 villas by law to Samuel Drayton as the rightful owner of the land beneath them. The judge did not rule immediately. Instead, he ordered an independent land survey to confirm every coordinate. For 3 days, a court-appointed team walked the property, measuring, photographing, and comparing old plats with modern GPS data. When the report came back, it was unequivocal. 100% of the villas were built within Drayton's boundary lines. The courtroom went silent as the findings were read aloud. Valerie sat motionless, her eyes fixed on the table. The reality she had fought to deny was now an official record of the court. Justice Rowan announced that he would deliver his ruling in 2 weeks, once all submissions were reviewed. But everyone in that room already knew what was coming. For Samuel, it wasn't about vengeance anymore. It was about principle. The land had belonged to his family for generations, and no HOA, no greedy developer, no legal loophole would erase that truth. In the days following the hearing, reporters swarmed his property line hoping for a statement. He never gave one. He simply went about his work, repairing fences, tending to his livestock, and walking the edges of his reclaimed estate. The villas stood silent, their gleaming windows reflecting the pastures they had stolen. For the new buyers, it was a nightmare. For the HOA, it was a humiliation. But for Samuel, it was vindication in motion. Still, one final test remained. Rumors began to circulate that Alder Ridge's parent development company was planning to appeal, not just to delay justice, but to bankrupt Samuel through legal attrition. Valerie, desperate to save herself, reached out privately to Samuel's attorney, offering a massive settlement in exchange for dropping the case. It was more money than most people would see in a lifetime, but Samuel had already made his choice. He wasn't interested in settling. He wanted the ruling, the court's public recognition that truth still mattered in a world that often forgot it. And when the date of judgment finally arrived, every seat in the courtroom was filled. The entire county, it seemed, wanted to witness the fall of the HOA that thought it owned everything. The courthouse was silent when Judge Rowan entered the chamber that morning. Every creak of the wooden benches echoed against the marble walls. Every whisper carried the weight of months of tension. The gallery was packed. Reporters, homeowners, lawyers, and even a few real estate agents who'd come to see the fate of Alder Ridge unfold. At the plaintiff's table, Samuel Drayton sat in his quiet composure, his eyes steady on the bench. Evelyn Marks, his attorney, had arranged the documents neatly before her. The deed, the surveys, the exhibits that told the story of arrogance and deceit. Across from them, Valerie Kane and the remaining HOA board members looked defeated. Their faces were pale, their lawyers rigid and expressionless. Judge Rowan adjusted his glasses and began. His tone was even, deliberate, and final. He reviewed the evidence on record, the 1894 Drayton deed, the continuous tax records, the 2018 mapping error, the unheeded surveyor warning, and the construction permits granted under false assumptions. Every detail had been verified independently by the court-appointed experts. The conclusion was irrefutable. The land beneath all 12 villas was, and had always been, private property belonging to the Drayton family. The courtroom was still as he turned a page on his notes. Then came the words that shattered Alder Ridge's illusion of control. The court hereby recognizes the lawful ownership of the disputed property as belonging to Mr. Samuel T. Drayton. All structures, improvements, and developments erected upon said property are likewise recognized under his ownership by virtue of the principle of land title superiority. A ripple of disbelief swept through the defense table. Valerie's lawyers rose, objecting immediately. They wanted the ruling suspended pending appeal, claiming the development had acted in good faith. But the judge cut through their protests with the weight of reason and law. Good faith does not excuse ignorance of record, nor does it excuse the willful disregard of documented ownership. The evidence shows that the defendants were made aware of potential boundary conflicts prior to construction and proceeded regardless. Every word carried the gravity of centuries of property law. Cold, exact, and final, the judgment was a complete victory for Samuel. Not only was ownership reaffirmed, but the HOA and Alder Ridge Development Corporation were held jointly liable for trespass, unlawful enrichment, and damages relating to unauthorized use of land. The court ordered immediate cessation of all HOA activities related to the villas until ownership. Transfer could be properly resolved. Then came the part that made the room collectively exhale, the financial verdict. The HOA and the development company were required to compensate Samuel for all tax losses, legal expenses, and property devaluation caused by the unlawful construction. Moreover, since the structures stood on his land, he was entitled to either retain them as his property or demand their removal at the defendant's expense. It was total dominance. Written into law, Samuel did not move, did not smile. He only closed his eyes for a moment, not in triumph, but in relief. He had spent over a year watching strangers reshape his inheritance. Now, by order of the state, it was his again. Valerie slumped in her chair. The reporters were already racing for the doors, eager to publish headlines that would travel across the country. The judge's gavel struck once. a sound that echoed like thunder through the courtroom. It was done. The aftermath began immediately. Within 48 hours, real estate listings for the villas at Alder Ridge vanished from every website. Buyers who had placed deposits began filing refund claims, only to discover that the development company's accounts had been frozen under the court's order. Construction crews arrived not to build, but to remove signage and secure the site for legal turnover. The HOA's reputation crumbled overnight. Homeowners within the original Alder Ridge community called emergency meetings, furious that their association dues had been used to fuel Valerie's reckless expansion. Lawsuits stacked one atop another like dominoes. For the developers, the fallout was worse. Their investors pulled out. Banks reviewed their lending practices. The name Alder Ridge Development Corp. became synonymous with scandal, whispered in every real estate circle as a warning of what greed could cost. And at the center of it all was Samuel, standing quietly at the edge of his newly reclaimed property. When the county officials returned to stake the rightful boundary markers, they found him waiting with his original plat map and a faint smile. He watched as they drove fresh posts into the soil, red flags fluttering under the sunlight. The lines were restored exactly where they had always been, the invisible border that the HOA had pretended did not exist. That evening, as dusk fell, he walked along the ridge where the villas stood. The luxury homes, once symbols of corporate pride, now looked eerily silent, their interiors dark, their windows reflecting the fading orange sky. Each one represented months of illegal labor and millions of dollars spent on someone else's land. He could have demanded their demolition, but he didn't. Not yet. He preferred to let the development company squirm under the uncertainty of his decision. He wanted them to live with the knowledge that they had built their empire on someone else's foundation. News outlets covered his story for weeks. They called him the man who outsmarted the HOA, the engineer who took back his land, and even the quiet conqueror of Alder Ridge. Interviews flooded in, but he refused them all. His satisfaction didn't come from fame. It came from the silence, the peaceful kind that returns only when justice has settled the air. Behind closed doors, however, the HOA wasn't finished. Valerie's legal team filed notice of appeal within 10 days, claiming procedural bias and disproportionate penalty. It was a desperate move, a last attempt to delay the inevitable. But Samuel was prepared for that, too. Evelyn had already anticipated the appeal and filed a cross motion to enforce the original judgment during the appeal process, ensuring that Samuel's ownership remained active. The villas, legally speaking, already belonged to him. Weeks passed. The story faded from front pages, but the court battle remained alive in the background. The appellate hearing loomed on the horizon, and though the HOA's case grew weaker by the day, their desperation grew louder. Valerie herself had vanished from public view. Rumors spread that she'd resigned, fled the state, or faced pressure from the very investors she had once impressed. The HOA board was fractured, half its members replaced by residents determined to clean house. Meanwhile, Samuel began quietly exploring possibilities. A local architect approached him with a proposal to convert the villas into eco-retreat lodges. A charity organization offered to buy several as housing for veterans. Others suggested auctioning them as reclaimed luxury homes with a notorious backstory. He hadn't decided yet, because deep down, Samuel wasn't done. The court victory had restored his land, but not his peace. Something still lingered, a thread that hadn't been pulled. During his legal review one evening, he discovered something curious. An offhand reference in the development company's records to a secondary land acquisition plan involving the adjacent hillside. The document was marked confidential, filed just before the lawsuit began. It mentioned plans for an underground waterline that crossed even further into his territory. The HOA had not only stolen his surface land, they had planned to dig beneath it. Samuel's jaw tightened as the pieces began to form. The villas had been just the beginning. There was more beneath the surface, literally and legally, and if the HOA thought they could salvage anything from the wreckage, they were about to learn their second and final lesson. For most men, victory in court would have marked the end of the war. But for Samuel Drayton, it was merely the midpoint, the calm before another storm. His instincts as an engineer, sharpened through decades of reading blueprints and uncovering hidden flaws, refused to rest. There was something off about the HOA's actions, something that didn't align with the panic and surrender they showed in court. A few weeks after the ruling, while organizing his case files in the study, Samuel came across a document buried deep within the discovery. Records, an engineering addendum labeled Phase 3, Utility Expansion, Internal Draft. It bore the signature of Alder Ridge Development, Corp's project manager, and contained schematics for a proposed underground system, water mains, fiber lines, and power conduits, all running beneath the villas and extending into untouched portions of the Drayton estate. That caught his attention immediately. The plans went far, beyond what had ever been approved by the county. They included a subterranean pumping station, one not listed in any public zoning document. According to the coordinates, the planned pump sat directly under Samuel's eastern pasture, near the natural spring that supplied his property's private water well. Someone had planned to reroute his natural water source into the HOA's infrastructure. It wasn't just theft of land anymore. It was theft of resources, a deliberate effort to control the groundwater rights tied to the Drayton estate. And the most chilling part? The documents were dated 6 months before the villas broke ground. This wasn't negligence. It was premeditated. Samuel's composure hardened into resolve. He began investigating quietly. He returned to the site at night with a flashlight, moving along the new pavement that led to the vacant villas. Under the soft hum of insects, he found it, a freshly welded metal hatch half hidden behind one of the unfinished garages. It wasn't part of the original blueprints. When he pried open the cover, a hollow echo rose from below, a steel maintenance shaft leading downward into darkness. A faint hum vibrated through the air, mechanical and steady. He climbed down partway and saw it, a partially completed water control unit, powered and connected to underground piping that stretched toward his spring. The HOA hadn't stopped construction after the lawsuit. They'd tried to finish their secret project in the shadows. He documented everything: photographs, coordinates, timestamps, video footage. The next morning, he called Evelyn, his attorney. Together, they compiled the findings and filed an emergency motion requesting court authorization to inspect and seize all underground installations constructed without consent. The court responded swiftly. Within 48 hours, a county enforcement team and a state environmental officer arrived at Alder Ridge under court order. Samuel guided them to the hatch. When they descended, what they found stunned even the officials. A network of steel and PVC conduits running in multiple directions, one leading directly toward the aquifer beneath Samuel's land, and another connecting to the main utility lines serving the original Alder Ridge subdivision. It was a covert water diversion system. The HOA and its developers had been planning to draw from his spring to supply their entire expansion, saving millions on utility permits and fees. The inspectors sealed the site immediately. News broke the next day. HOA found illegally drilling beneath private land. Environmental violation confirmed. The revelation reignited the media firestorm. For the second time in a year, Alder Ridge's name flooded the headlines, now tied not just to property theft, but environmental crime. The HOA board tried to distance themselves, claiming ignorance. They blamed subcontractors, engineers, and former project heads. But the chain of signatures on the internal files led back to Valerie Kane. Even after her resignation, her name appeared as the approving authority for Phase 3 utility integration. Federal investigators entered the picture next. Environmental Protection Agency agents subpoenaed company records. The county froze all development permits indefinitely. The damage was catastrophic. Investors fled entirely. The development company's stock collapsed. Lawsuits multiplied. The Alder Ridge HOA, once a symbol of suburban prosperity, became synonymous with fraud, corruption, and illegal land manipulation. And Samuel? He stayed still, deliberate, quiet, precise as ever. He had no need for vengeance anymore. The system was doing it for him. But there was one more move he hadn't revealed yet, one he'd been saving for exactly this moment. Months earlier, anticipating deeper corruption, he had purchased a full environmental rights policy for his property. The policy, insured under federal guidelines, granted him the right to claim compensation for any unauthorized extraction or interference with his natural resources. That clause now triggered automatically when the county confirmed the underground diversion system. His insurance claim went through. The payout was monumental, enough to cover every legal expense, every year of property maintenance, and more. But Samuel didn't stop there. He redirected a portion of the funds into something the HOA never saw coming, a full redevelopment proposal. While the villas sat empty, he submitted his own application to the county to repurpose the land and structures under a new entity, Drayton Ridge Heritage Estates. His proposal detailed the transformation of the seized villas into private eco-lodges, powered by solar grids and natural water restoration systems. The same homes that the HOA had built illegally were now being reclaimed legally as part of his own enterprise. It was poetic justice, profit born from the ruins of arrogance. As construction crews returned under his supervision, he oversaw every modification personally. He instructed that each villa retain one original plaque reading "Built by Alder Ridge," a permanent reminder of the hubris that birthed them. Meanwhile, the court's environmental hearing concluded with brutal efficiency. Valerie Kane was subpoenaed for fraud and environmental violation. Her assets were frozen pending investigation. Several contractors were blacklisted. The Alder Ridge HOA was formally dissolved. Its management transferred to a temporary state-appointed board. The transformation of power was complete. The HOA that once dictated lawn colors and mailbox designs was now powerless, dismantled by the very man they'd dismissed as an old rancher with outdated claims. As winter approached, the new Drayton Ridge signs gleamed under fresh coats of paint. Samuel's land was alive again, legally secure, environmentally protected, and financially thriving. But amid his triumph, he remained grounded. He'd learned something vital through the ordeal, that corruption doesn't die easily. It burrows deep, like the pipes he'd uncovered beneath his land. He'd reclaimed his property, but he also understood how fragile justice could be when the powerful twisted the system for profit. And as the final villa lights flickered on under his ownership, a new chapter of Alder Ridge began, one built not on deceit, but on principle. Yet deep down, Samuel sensed it wasn't entirely over. There were still whispers that the developers were regrouping, filing appeals, seeking loopholes and threatening a federal countersuit for losses incurred. He didn't fear them. He'd beaten them once in court, and he would do it again if he had to. Because the land was his, the truth was his, and the story was far from finished. The first snow of the season came quietly, blanketing the hills around Drayton Ridge in a calm that almost seemed deceptive. Beneath the frost, the earth still carried the scars of a long battle, both legal and moral. Samuel Drayton stood at the edge of the property line, his boots half buried in the cold soil, watching the faint lights of the villas flicker in the distance. They now bore his name. But the story behind them wasn't yet closed. Because justice, as Samuel had learned, wasn't a single event. It was an ongoing act of maintenance. And corruption, like weeds, had a way of growing back through cracks left unattended. The state's investigations had shaken Alder Ridge to its core, but the developers behind the HOA had deeper connections than anyone expected. Valerie Kane, though publicly disgraced and facing trial, had vanished into the folds of corporate redirection. Her development company quietly rebranded under a new name, Havenbrook Holdings, and filed appeals against the county's seizure orders. Their lawyers argued that the villas were built in good faith, claiming that any illegal infrastructure had been the result of rogue contractors and not company intent. They accused Samuel of profiteering from false claims, seeking to invalidate his insurance payout and repossess parts of the reclaimed property. It was, in essence, a declaration of war, One fought not with bulldozers this time, but with lawyers, lobbyists, and federal filings. Evelyn warned him the fight could drag on for years. "They're playing the long game now," she said. "They're banking on exhaustion, that you'll eventually give up or settle quietly." But Samuel wasn't a man who tired easily. He'd spent decades managing the slow grind of machinery, the patience of irrigation systems, the seasons of harvest. He understood endurance better than anyone at Havenbrook ever could. He gathered his evidence again: blueprints, drone footage, transaction records, environmental inspection reports. But this time, he went a step further. He filed a federal injunction under the Clean Water Act and Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, backed by both environmental data and expert testimony. The move escalated the case beyond state lines, placing it under the jurisdiction of the U.S. Department of Justice. That was the moment everything changed. Federal agents subpoenaed Havenbrook's corporate records, tracing offshore accounts and environmental certifications, falsified under Valerie's signature. Within weeks, an unsealed indictment revealed the truth. Havenbrook was a shell company. The same directors, the same capital flow, and even the same project files as Alder Ridge. The revelation detonated like a bomb in the media. Headlines screamed Alder Ridge HOA rebranded to evade federal penalties. DOJ confirms link to environmental fraud. The nation watched in fascination. Property owners, environmentalists, and rural advocates rallied behind Samuel's story. What began as a neighborhood dispute had grown into a national symbol of rural resilience against corporate overreach. Samuel was no longer just a rancher defending his land. He had become the face of a movement. Public pressure mounted so intensely that federal prosecutors expanded the investigation into a full-scale criminal case. Valerie Kane, now tracked and arrested in Nevada, faced charges of environmental tampering, wire fraud, and obstruction of justice. Her associates, developers, and complicit engineers followed. Havenbrook's assets were frozen. Federal marshals arrived at their headquarters with warrants in hand. By the end of that winter, the company that had built 12 villas on stolen ground had been dismantled, piece by piece, file by file, lie by lie. And as the snow melted, Samuel attended the final court hearing that would close the case forever. The courtroom was packed, journalists, residents, even former HOA members. Across the aisle sat the remnants of Havenbrook's legal team, disheveled and weary. The judge's tone was final, unwavering. The court finds that the defendants willfully engaged in unauthorized construction, resource diversion, and fraudulent concealment. Ownership of all disputed properties and associated assets is permanently awarded to the plaintiff, Mr. Samuel Drayton. Silence. Then applause. Soft at first, then swelling into a standing ovation. For the first time in years, Samuel felt something heavier than anger lift from his chest. The land had returned home. After the ruling, he walked outside, snow crunching under his boots. Reporters swarmed, asking how it felt to win so decisively. He answered simply, "Justice isn't revenge, it's restoration." But even as he said it, he knew the deeper truth. Justice required vigilance. The greed that built Alder Ridge would find new soil somewhere else. That was the nature of ambition unbound by ethics. Weeks later, as the season shifted, Samuel turned his focus entirely to rebuilding Drayton Ridge Heritage Estates. The villas transformed into living spaces powered by renewable energy. He invited local families, conservationists, and veterans to manage the land with him, turning a battlefield into a community built on trust. He installed an educational center at the heart of the estate, a modest building made of reclaimed wood and steel, where visitors could learn about sustainable land management, property law awareness, and environmental protection. He called it the Ridge Foundation. In the months that followed, donations poured in. Universities reached out for collaboration. The county designated the property as a heritage preservation zone. And fittingly, the first award he received wasn't for wealth or victory, but for environmental stewardship. On the day of the foundation's opening, Samuel stood before a crowd of reporters and neighbors. Behind him, the villas shone in the sunlight, symbols of what justice, patience, and truth could build. He raised a hand and said, "They built these villas to erase my name. Now they stand to carry it forward." The audience applauded again, but Samuel's gaze drifted toward the horizon. Beyond the hills, the land stretched quiet and endless. He thought of his father, who'd built the ranch generations ago. He thought of the soil, the spring, the fight that had nearly consumed him. And he realized that every battle, no matter how brutal, was a test of who deserved to shape the land. Those who exploited it, or those who nurtured it. As the crowd dispersed and dusk painted the sky in hues of gold and blue, Samuel took one last walk through the villas. He paused by one of the old plaques still mounted on a wall. Built by Alder Ridge. He didn't remove it. He didn't need to, because it no longer marked their triumph. It marked their defeat. The villas stood not as monuments to greed, but as proof that no force, no corporation, no HOA could ever truly own the spirit of the land. And when he turned toward the setting sun, the light caught his face, resolute, calm, unshaken. The fight was over, but the legacy had just begun. The screen fades from the golden light of sunset to the aerial view of the villas. Pristine, silent, and undeniably his. What began as theft ended as poetic justice. The same HOA that bulldozed boundaries, mocked property rights, and built their empire on arrogance was brought to its knees, not with violence, not with revenge, but with truth. Samuel Drayton didn't just win back his land. He exposed a system built on greed, where paperwork was weaponized against the powerless, and power was mistaken for ownership. He turned their pride into evidence, their luxury into liability. Those 12 villas still stand today, not as symbols of wealth, but as warnings. Because when you build on deceit, it doesn't matter how beautiful the walls look. They'll always belong to someone else. And as the camera pans across the plaque that reads The Ridge Foundation, Samuel's voice echoes softly in the distance. Justice isn't about revenge. It's about restoration. The music swells. The image fades to black. Because sometimes the best revenge is letting them build everything on land that was never theirs. This was HOA built 12 villas on my property. I let them finish construction, then brought the deed to court. Subscribe for more real stories of greed, justice, and the unexpected power of patience.